Welcome to this session on EV economics. You know, there are many layers and much complexity when it comes to EVs, and obviously it touches literally every aspect of dealership operations. And it's just not a matter of what we see today. It's really a matter of, as Wayne Gretzky famously said, I don't skate to where the puck is, I skate to where it's going. And so we're very fortunate to have these three gentlemen joining us today. I've got Steve Greenfield from Automotive Ventures, and Steve's got a big, deep background in retail automotive, most notably in the last 5 years as the founder and managing partner of Automotive Ventures, and who has a hyper focus on just the future of retail automotive, but also what innovators and solution creators are doing now to solve some pain points. I've got Phil Villegas is also joining us from Axiom Advisors, the preeminent audit and accounting firm. They do forensics for dealers. They assist dealers in buy sells with legal matters, as well as helping them up level their accounting and their financial readiness. And then we've got the one and only Michael Dunne, who's considered the foremost authority globally in EVs. And I'm looking forward to Michael's insights because he's going to be able to share with us, again, not just things that we're seeing that seem to be laying on the surface today, but what are some things that are coming in 2024, 2025 that quite potentially are going to rock the landscape of EVs. So with that, gentlemen, thank you for joining, and I'm going to pitch it to Steve. If you wouldn't mind, go ahead and take the wheel of this discussion, and let's jump in.
That's great. Well, thanks, David. Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here. And Michael and Phil, we're very happy to be here sharing the mic with you guys today as well. If I'm going to set the stage, David, I'll just kind of reiterate what you said. People accuse me because of my LinkedIn post that I'm anti-EV, and I'm anything but. I think I'm more practical around, I think as a drivetrain, there has been and will continue to be demand. What demand will be sort of when we settle down to like a natural state, we're starting to see evidence of that already, right? I think in the last week here, we've seen Bank of America reduce their longer term forecasts in terms of EV penetration in the U.S. Michael can speak very eloquently to what's happening overseas, specifically in China, et cetera. And we're starting to see
also, Steve. Did you see the announcement, right, with Hertz pulling back?
It hurts too, yeah. So we're starting to see, dealers are feeling, a tale of two cities. New vehicle inventories are backing up. So compared to ICE vehicles, we've got much higher days of supply of EVs, especially across certain brands. As you said, David, we're seeing some of the fleet companies that have had their fingers burned with Tesla's price manipulations, drops last year, and we've got both Hertz and Six Rent-A-Car saying we don't want to hold these in our inventory any longer because of the price volatility, and also they're starting to get an indication that the repair costs, not the maintenance costs are much lower on EVs, but when they do get into even a minor fender bender, the repair costs are significantly higher, and the complexity of the repair costs. So the combination of price volatility impacting the value of their portfolio, and then the repair complexity. I think it's easier for these fleets to say, I'm just not going to bother right now, right? I mean, I'm just going to have ICE vehicles. They're not feeling a lot of demand from consumers who want to rent these things. And so that's also going to mean, probably in the short term at least, more of these EVs coming on the market, specifically Teslas, through the auction lanes. There'll be more supply. And David, I mean, you felt this, but many of our dealer investors were doing quite a nice business a year ago in used Teslas, and they were taking them on trades, and they were selling them and making good profit. And we have many of them now that won't even touch them on trade. If a consumer comes in with a used Tesla, they're like, we'll go down the street, go to CarMax, go get a quote somewhere else. But we don't want to take the inventory risk any longer, as Hertz is doing the same thing. So it's been an interesting year to see this year play out. But I think all of those things have the dealer body in general much more cautious than they were. Just a week ago, we had CES, and I know Michael was out there, and I was out there as well. And fascinating to see, many of the OEMs pulled out. They didn't even have a footprint this year. And the talk was not about, with the exception of Honda, no other automakers were really talking about EVs, other than there were 2 prototypes for VinFast, and I'm sure we'll talk about VinFast today as well. But not a lot of buzz at CES. And as we enter in a week or so into NADA, it'll be very interesting to see, one, what's top of mind for dealers, what the scuttlebutt is around EVs in general. I think we can anticipate, and then what the OEMs are selling, and what the OEM booths are selling. And I don't think it's going to be a big push on EVs right now.
Steve, I'll jump in, and then I'd love to pitch it over to Michael. And thank you for that great introduction to this conversation, because it just validates this is complicated. This is complicated, it's volatile, and it's prone to shift, it's prone to change. The one thing, on one hand, it is irrefutable that EVs are not just here, they're not going anywhere. It's irrefutable that we will forever, until the day I die and much longer, see continued growth and adoption for EVs, both on the new car front and the used car front, right? And we're likely to see a lot of new contenders come in that ultimately shift the landscape, and that's what I want to talk about with Michael. But I do want to also mention one other thing that you noticed at CES that you had shared before we jumped on the session, and that was the charging networks were conspicuously absent. In other words, the ones that had all this excitement and, the ebullience and enthusiasm. And it's funny, isn't it funny, guys, that for anybody that we know in our lives, when you don't hear from somebody for a long period of time in a business, it usually means they don't have a whole lot good to say, right? When things are going great, we hear from them all the time. And I think that's really analogous to this recharge. But Michael, I'm gonna send it over to you. Because Steve mentioned VinFast. Of course, you've got BYD, and you've got, is it Zhangpeng, and you've got NIO, and you've got a slew of companies in China and that are creating these cars. And by the way, we only have 8% of new car sales, roughly 7.5%, 8% in EVs, while Europe has 14.9, and China's got, I think, north of 40%, heading towards 60 and 80. So I'm just curious, what do you see in terms of the impact on the economics for the retail automotive environment as a dealer here, on a number of fronts? Fisker wanting to go to a dealer model, VinFast and BYD wanting to do dealer models, and then you still have the direct consumers out there like Rivian and Lucid trying to find their way. What are we likely to see in 2024 and beyond?
2024. So let's go back to the floor of CES, as Steve was saying. I had the opportunity to walk the floor with investors from Toyota who are now moving urgently, aware that they're behind things when it comes to EVs. And the people I was walking the show with said, "Hey, wait a second, what's that? TOGG, TOGG. I've never heard of that company. Oh, that's a startup in Turkey doing electric cars. Oh my God, what's that big sign over there? MIH Foxconn. What is that? Oh, that's a Taiwanese-based startup. They're working together with Foxconn to do a platform for cheap EVs. Oh, okay. And then VinFast, they've got 5, 6 models, and they have a concept pickup truck. My goodness, what is going on here?" And quickly they came to the conclusion, what's changed is that the barriers of entry to get into the automotive industry have fallen dramatically with EVs. So you have countries around the world like Vietnam and Turkey saying, hey, we can do this too. So there's a proliferation of brands. And as the Toyota people said, they may look small today, and they are small today, but every time VinFast sells a car anywhere in the world, it's one less customer that Toyota would have captured. So they're nervous with good reason, but they're most concerned, of course, about this Godzilla of a juggernaut of a nation called China that is now the world's leading manufacturer and buyer of cars. The number one manufacturer of electric cars, builds more electrics than the rest of the world combined. The number one exporter of vehicles, surpassing Japan last year. And if you ask me, when I talk to dealers in the United States, I'll often ask them, wait, what's keeping you up at night? And they'll say, well, what to do about moving EVs? Or they'll say, this thing called software-defined vehicles, what exactly is it and how is it going to change my life? Or they might say, oh, I don't know the model. Are we going to go direct or are we going to go stay with franchise? So those are all genuinely serious disruptions to their lives. But for 2024 and beyond, I feel as though the single biggest impact will come out of China. They're hell-bent on shipping their cars to global markets, including the United States and Europe. And they can come in at very aggressive price points. And with so much so that it would be an earthquake for Detroit. Absolutely an earthquake. So what do I mean by pricing? BYD has very good, high-quality cars that start at $20,000, $25,000. There will be an import duty on top of that. Okay, it knocks it up to $30,000. Still very competitive. So if those tariffs don't remain in place, I could see for dealers both sort of an upset and an opportunity. Upset their existing business, opportunity to lock onto these leading Chinese automakers that are very powerful.
Hey,
we
Michael,
don't see them on American roads yet, but we see them in virtually every other market in the world.
Michael, don't you think it's highly likely that this is a significantly different situation versus when Datsun and Toyota and Honda first hit the shores, and then you had the Korean manufacturers like Hyundai, hit the shores, and you had that slow roll to adoption, and the vehicles they came out with, the 4995 Elantra, was basically perceived as being slightly safer than a grocery cart on the highway and slightly marginally nicer quality than a Yugo. These cars appear to be no joke, and these $30,000 models with 400 miles of range, with performance, and with technology that I was, one of these manufacturers has got 12 screens in the car, including in the sunroof, right? I mean, these are not what we saw 20 years ago, or I was thinking back in I would say this would have been in the mid 80s with when the Koreans first came into the country, or 20 years before with the Japanese. Is that true? These are formidable.
Absolutely. They're there with quality and technology. I had the opportunity recently to drive two vehicles at BYD up in Pasadena. One's the Tang SUV and the other one's a Han full-size sedan the size of a Model S. What are they priced at? $75,000, and they're not shy about it. Absolutely great value for money. And in the most recent visit, I was there with the president of a major dealer group here in the United States who sells a lot of Hyundai today and Genesis. And after a day of drives, he said, wow, these cars are right there. I could sell a lot of these today. So that was something. This is a guy who's been in the industry 30 years. And he had separately test driven other Chinese brands, and he said, no, this one's legit. BYD has the $20,000 and $30,000 cars, but it also has the $70,000, $80,000 high quality, high performance. The software is there. So I feel like for many years, it was a boy who cried wolf. Oh, the Chinese are coming, but they're not. Chinese are coming. No, they're not. Oh, look. No. This time, mark my words.
Go ahead, Phil.
One thing I find interesting is that the perspective that Toyota feels like they're behind or playing catch up, where almost based on what we're discussing, that almost looks like currently like there's an overcorrection. And if there was one manufacturer in the U.S. that possibly the EV strategy or the current strategy is worked out in dealers' benefit, where it doesn't seem like an overcorrection, is Toyota. So it's just I find that interesting.
Don't you think
you make a great point, because Toyota has been steadfast in their approach. Hey, we need to have several different powertrains. We're not leaving that. But at the same time, privately, with me, they're saying, yes, we recognize we've moved too slowly on electrics. We got some catching up to do.
It's so remarkable, the difference from just, literally, Michael, 1 year ago, or Steve, 1 year ago. I mean, where Toyota was steadfast in really continuing to hyper-focus on hybridization. I don't believe that's going to go away. And they weren't wrong that I could take, from their perspective, we could take the minerals needed for one extended range battery vehicle, and I could create 90 hybrids from it, which is not only a benefit from a financial perspective and a sales perspective, but environmentally. But when, to your point, and to Phil, to your point, when you have a company of that stature going, holy shit, we may have been a little too overly conservative. And maybe that's a reflection, Michael, tell me what you think, or Steve, of the fact that Japan as a nation really focused on hybridization. I think the last numbers I saw, you have only 3% BEV in Japan, 3%. That's it. You have 51% ICE in Japan, and the remaining 46% is hybrids. And they've achieved a national, our equivalent of CAFE, of national EPA of 55 miles to the gallon, right? So currently in the United States, there's only one car that can really rival that, and ironically, it's a Toyota. So, Steve, what does that tell you when you have what most would consider to be the best, smartest, most sophisticated OEM out there, Toyota, looking at the current landscape and saying, man, oh man, we need to do something?
Yeah, well, I think it's you rewind the clock a year, like you said, David, and what's changed. You had at some point here we'll get into Michael's predictions for 2024. If you don't want to hear some of those, but somewhat related. You had some of these automakers that were convinced that they were going to move entirely 100% from ICE to EV by within a 10-year time frame, and we've seen some minor backpedaling. I suspect over the course of the year we're going to see a lot more backpedaling. But I think if anything, a lot of folks overestimated what demand might be for electrification. Toyota, whether they were smarter or luckier, perhaps, some accuse them of just dragging their feet, but it seems like time, to Phil's point, has played out pretty well for them in terms of maybe they were dragging their feet for a while, but time has shown that it's worked out pretty well for them. So they look like every other automaker on the face of the earth, doesn't know how quickly that, at least in the U.S. consumer is going to be prepared to make the shift over. We've seen studies that show 50% of EV owners, the next vehicle they buy is an ICE vehicle, which doesn't mean they're replacing EVs.
Owners.
Tesla owners, yes. Doesn't mean they're replacing their EVs with an ICE vehicle, but it means the next vehicle they put in their garage or in their driveway is an ICE vehicle, right? So we haven't seen this tsunami where consumers who buy EVs are just wholly convinced that that's the way that they're going to go and not go back. Quite the contrary. But who knows? I mean, we could have a bet here. Maybe we should all bet 5 years from years from now. What is the penetration of passenger vehicles that are plug-in electric? And we may all converge on the same outcome. But I mean, it's not. Well, from my perspective, it's not going to be 50%.
I think one of the things that's interesting that any of you can speak to, and Phil, I want to hear from you on the financial side. But when you look at the manufacturer's product pipeline, of course, Biden would like to see 65% by 2032. I don't see that happening or even coming close to it. Some people are predicting that we're going to get to 30%. I'm not so sure that's going to happen either. But I think one of the things that's interesting is, there's the prediction of what we're going to sell, and then there is very much the reality of what's going to be produced. And I think the delta on those two numbers are not being spoken about enough. So if you look at product plans, and I was just listening to John Murphy from B of A, who famously does the Car Wars report every year and does just fantastic research. And when they went through the arduous process of figuring out these product plans and what the implications are going to be, it would appear that approximately 39 to 40% of production will be EVs by 2030. Now, that has nothing to do with what people are going to buy. And the delta between the two sounds like it can render some challenges from a financial perspective. Phil, I'm curious, as you talk to your clients across the country, Do you hear concerns from them at this point about the implications of EVs from the standpoint that they just take maybe 30, 40, 50% longer to sell? They're on balance more expensive, 12 to 15 grand more expensive. Mercedes dealers, for example, have 3 times more inventory, EV inventory on hand than they sell. Sales compensation. You know, if a Ford dealer is selling F-150 Lightnings for a $3 grand, $3,500 loss, you're paying commission on gross that doesn't exist. I mean, what does that look like right now? And what would you say to dealers that they should become aware of and really start to focus on this year?
No, it's a valid point, and there are valid concerns with the dealer base. It's interesting. Laughing with a large Mercedes dealer, where the joke was like, yeah, I was in a situation where I had way too much EV inventory. Now I just have too much, saying the things that improved over the last few months. But no, it's we have, we're in, and some of the discussions is, kind of marrying, reconciling the manufacturer speak to what the actual market environment is. And, and so much probably, as we see this, like in terms of like open point applications or even, expansion, some of the manufacturer talking points, particularly if, I'd want to say from probably particularly Porsche or the Volkswagen group, as far as going to this very heavy push Tesla type of approach to now, what's probably good for their stock price, or what's good for the general market, and then what's actually translating to dealers. So, what we're finding with the dealers is it's almost like they're put into a forced method of subsidizing these talking points of these ventures items, like, that may help with their stock price, but simply, it's almost like, it reminds me back of the days with working with the public companies. Like we can't cash a check for market share. Why is that in my pay plan? So it's so similarly, the dealers are overly concerned with, as far as you get to a circumstance of the fixed asset investment, the capitalization, the additional training. You have circumstances where they have limited technicians that can work on these vehicles, and now also and kind of probably go all over, where it does appear, and at least from our side, doing some of our internal work, particularly in the service department, a lot of these products were rushed to market in an effort to be competitive. We are finding a very large, the concern was, well, there's not going to be any service work on these electric cars. Electric cars have proven to be very, very, very profitable from warranty perspective right now, because there are so many battery replacements. So it's
true.
So from that side, it's just you have an area where it was accelerated very quickly. The dealers had to subsidize, or continuing to subsidize, a big portion of this, playing catch up both in tech training and having the lifts, having the proper tooling. And then also being able to then, and at the worst part is that the dealers are the face point, or the contact point to the customer dealing with these issues, and having to resolve it if they have a car, or that the car cannot be replaced here for another, or it's going to be in the shop for several months. So I was going to all over the board here on this one, but
well, I think it's a fair point though, because it is all over the board. And I was going to say, can we summarize by saying that is it fair to say that EVs are not just simply new models, as I've been asserting, but they represent an entirely different business model? It's a different audience that you're marketing to. It's a different experience that they expect. And it's a different business model that it renders on the financial side of the dealership, which tends to have tentacles through every department. Is that fair?
Oh, I agree, and we had this conversation, and it's a very valid point. It brings the argument to, almost like Toyota did with Scion, representing it as a separate section within their financial statement, or even Mini with BMW. There is a very strong argument to say that that EV as a whole, both based on personnel dedicated, capital investment. We're already seeing where on the GM financial statements that they're breaking out, at least on page 7, the aging of the inventory, how many of these vehicles you have, the sales. Other manufacturers are still listing it as a standalone unit, but I believe that there will likely need to be this kind of bifurcation of the numbers. These are just not normal models. So to your point, yes, it's almost like because you're also dealing with a whole different breed of competitors. It's not like we're just traditionally, let's just say Ford against GM and Chrysler, or Toyota against Honda and Nissan. Now you're having to compete with some groups that are not your traditional dealers that have much different infrastructure, and also having to report on a very similar, probably just apples to oranges altogether, that don't have the same kind of competitive or as far as financial pressures that the dealers have. So the whole thing is really convoluted itself as far as in the financial reporting, being able to break that out, and also how to do forecasts and projections as far as in entering markets, because who are you now fighting, in many ways.
And one of the things I find interesting is we may very well be in a situation to where, the more effective or prolific you are selling EVs, the less profitable you're going to become. We haven't ever seen that before. Usually the most prolific, performers win. Steve, with respect to BYD, as Michael brought up, and this is an incredibly formidable competitor, not just to Toyota, but in terms of how it's going to shift the landscape in the United States. They're also brilliant in a number of regards in that they're going to, using a dealer network, not direct consumer. A direct consumer model from a Chinese company is probably going to not go over very well, right? So they had the foresight and the wisdom and the brilliance to do that. And Michael had shared with me in a previous conversation that, these companies are speaking already. They're here. They're not coming. They're here. They got people here. They're on the ground, boots on the ground, and they're already talking to prospective dealer partners. Now, they're not going after, they're not, Michael, you had said, hey, they're not apologetic. They're not shy. They're proud of this vehicle, these high performance vehicles. I think there very much seems to be the same when it comes to their franchise. They're not going out there and begging, the average dealer or below average dealer to, hey, come on board and represent BYD. Don't want them. They want the top 50. They want the top 100. So my question to you is, if I happen to be in a marketplace, like there's no question BYD and others are coming. If I happen to be in a marketplace where I compete with a top 50 or a top 100, may I find myself very quickly at a competitive disadvantage when BYD gets added to their portfolio?
Michael, you want that one?
You go first, Steve. I got some thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, my thought is, and I encourage dealers to be very open-minded around new points, right? Whether it's talking to VinFast, we've seen Fisker, I think you mentioned, David, recently decide that they were going to go from a direct channel to a dealer network. And, I think dealers should be very open-minded.
Just because they couldn't handle all the demand.
That's right. Thinking back to, as you said, David, when Hyundai first entered the country, going back further, when Honda first entered the country, when Toyota first entered the country, I'm certain there were many dealers that were very closed-minded and said, there'll never be an appetite in the American sort of like consciousness for like these smaller, lower powered, smaller displacement vehicles. But look how history played out. And yeah, it did take a long time, but it played out quite well for those dealers that were willing to take the risk early on. So I will be interested to hear what Michael thinks. But, I think I like him think it's inevitable. It may take some time and they'll have to work through taxes and tariffs and such, but it's inevitable. So shame on the dealer that isn't, one, keeping track of what's going on, subscribing to Michael's newsletter and understanding how things are evolving within the Chinese market and just how much of a formidable force they are in terms of an export market now. But two, and even more importantly than that, just stay open-minded. Stay open-minded because opportunities are going to present themselves. Some good, some bad, but unless you've got your hand up and you're open-minded, to your point, David, you don't want the big 50 coming in and steamrolling you in your local market.
The person that brought me into Mercedes-Benz William Smythe. His introduction to Mercedes was in the 60s when Mercedes offered him a franchise. He took it, and then he gave it back after a couple of years. I don't want it. This thing's not doing anything. And Mercedes literally had to put on the full court press to get him to take the franchise. They begged him, please, take this franchise back. Like, what is that, to your point, Steve, what does that decision look like if he says, nah, I don't think this German car thing is going anywhere, right? Same thing with Lexus. You know, you can't get a Lexus dealer to save yourself. Same thing with Toyota. Though most of those brands, their models were literally considered laughable. You remember the Datsun B210, for example, the original Toyota Corona that was out there, of course, the Hyundai Elantra. And you look at these now, it is an investment in time, but it's also a great point you're making. Boy, if you're closed-minded, you know, you have zero opportunity, zero, regardless of whether you love EVs or not, you know, are pro or against. It's just a matter of time before these things are going to continue to take a greater and greater foothold. Michael, my question, same thing to you is, you know, what is the ramifications or implications of BYD's approach that, hey, we're going to go after we think that we're the best of the best and we offer a great product. We're going to go after the best dealers in the country. What do you think that means to anybody who's competing with one of those dealers that ends up taking on the BYD franchise or others?
If I'm a dealer in the United States today, there's no question that I'd be all over. I'd say, who are the top 5 Chinese auto manufacturers in terms of exports globally? I want to get with them immediately because there's already runs on the board. China exported 5 billion cars last year. What's less well known is the majority of those cars were ICE. 70% were ICE vehicles, and 30%, they're just getting started with the EV. So, and in BYD's case, almost half of their production was PHEVs. So the Chinese offerings are not one-trick ponies. You can have gas, you can have PHEV, you can have full BEV. So that's one. You know, open our minds. Just because we don't see Chinese cars on American roads today, don't fall into a false sense of like, oh, they're not real. No, they're real. Second thing to keep in mind, it's already happening in Mexico. The number one supplier of vehicles to Mexico last year was China. China sold more cars into Mexico than any other country, including Mexico itself. So they're on our doorstep with their products. And I'm aware that BYD and others are planning manufacturing plants in Mexico, not just for the Mexican market, but through the North American trade agreements to come up from the southern flank into the U.S. market. So all signals are that the Chinese need, oh, by the way, this is a very important point. China's domestic market has slowed dramatically in recent years. It's about at the same, EVs have taken off, ICE demand has fallen. It's roughly the same level as it was 5 years ago. What does that mean? It means China's sitting on massive overcapacity, price wars at home, margins falling at home. All efforts are now geared toward let's ship our cars overseas. And where can we make profits? Well, we can make them in Europe and the United States. So in a way, we have that leverage. You know, they need the U.S. market. If they stay at home, they'll drown in their own overcapacity. So all signals are the Chinese, one way or another, are coming, whether it's through Mexico or directly. And not only with BEVs, but with a full lineup of vehicles, powertrains, and prices from $11,000 all the way up to $160,000. So if I sound like I'm trumpeting on behalf of China, I just would like to say, yes, this time is for real. And if I'm in the United States, I want to be all.
Would you as a dealer, would you be? Oh, go ahead, Phil.
No, I was going to say that what, you know, it's. I'll let you finish, David. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, I wouldn't want to be a dealer under a false sense of security. You know, Steve's talking about be open-minded, and you're saying something similar. You know, another rub of this is that there's been a rash of legislation that's surfaced, you know, over the last 12, 18 months to protect dealers and the you know, their rights, their franchise agreements Florida, for example, you can't go direct to consumer unless you previously had physical locations, right? Which means Tesla, you're locked out. I believe it was Mississippi or Louisiana just said, hey, stay out. You can't go to direct to consumer, period. California's enacted recent legislation, and there's more to come. But while that will protect you from direct to consumer models, for example, the minute Fisker goes to a dealer network, that deal's off. When BYD comes to market with a dealer network, VinFast, that deal's off. Franchise laws do not protect you from consumers having access to additional models that hit the United States shore. And there's not a dang thing you could do about it, but perhaps be open-minded, perhaps look into it, and perhaps, I don't know, even embrace it. Because there's no question of two things I think are irrefutable. Number one, EVs will be growing every year here on out. And two, we will continue to see new entrants. I'm not talking new models, new manufacturers enter our landscape, and that's going to significantly shift. As a footnote, Steve, to what you said, by the way, before Toyota and Datsun and Honda came to town, the big three had over 70% market share. 70%. And the big three doesn't even, the big three now includes Toyota.
but I see one thing here, David, and it's, if you look at it, there's really two channels, and it's almost, you have to break up the discussion. There's one channel of EVs coming through your existing, manufacturer, which I fully understand, but you have the other channel, which I'm a little bit more skeptical of, and I know that there's probably some great problems where it's adopting a whole new franchise. I mean, I know you mentioned the conversation with Mr. Smythe and Mercedes begging him, but likely that franchise value, had you approached them 20 years later, to buy that franchise, probably wasn't that much more than, you could probably still acquire. My largest, I think there's and don't quote me on the numbers, I think electric technology was at the turn of this early 1900s.
That's
and
right.
then oil came along, and I believe there was over 100 manufacturers. My largest concern, and my advice, what we would probably discuss with dealers, is with any emerging dealer, particularly, or you have emerging brands, and then you have with the technology now. The concern and a lot of the concern and hesitation with the electric vehicle side is, are the current lithium ions, is that the end all be all? And you hear about solid state batteries and different things. Our view would be, and we've had some clients who have been approached with or in discussions with VinFast, is, it's yes. What will be the capital investment? Is this simply a franchise you could tuck in a couple $100,000 worth of parts and some training, or is this going to be to the point where you have to build them a facility and it's going to require a capital investment of several $1 million? Depending on where that conversation goes, it's more than likely, it's, unless it's a tuck-in, something that's going to be minimal, financial exposures, more than likely from our side is going to be likely a pass, because the eventuality of how that brand will go from today to being the next Toyota, the next Mercedes, there's no track record to where those brands don't get there in a minimum of probably 10, 15, 20 years. So,
gentlemen, isn't it fair to say, though? I mean, the big news also yesterday about ETFs, right, with Bitcoin. And I do think that EVs and EV models in general are a little bit analogous to Bitcoin. I think, clearly today, Tesla is Bitcoin. Rivian today, at least for the time being, or perhaps Hyundai, might be Ethereum. And if you look at the 50-odd models out there, most of them are struggling to sell a very low number of vehicles. They are the equivalent of Dogecoin, no offense, or to either Dogecoin or the models, by the way, or Shibu, or, any of these other, somebody was joking that the Belichick coin is probably going to come out soon, after that he was just canned by the Patriots. But I mean, isn't it true that is going to be a risk? But on the other hand, Michael said something I think is a big, massively important. And that is, he said, I'm going to go out and I'm going to look for the ones that are dominating in China, right? One thing that we know in this business if a car doesn't sell as a new car very well, it curiously doesn't sell that well as a used car, right? It doesn't like show up as a used car and get, reinvented and all of a sudden it's got massive demand. So isn't it fair to say that as long as, to Steve's point and to Michael's point and your point, that if people do due diligence and they're aligning themselves with what is clearly a brand that's going to be here for the long term, built to last, they would probably be very wise to consider at least taking that brand on potentially if they want to sustain for the long term their own market share in their geographic area. Isn't that fair, Michael?
If someone told you here's a brand that's within 2 years will surpass Ford in terms of global sales, and within 3 years will be bigger than GM, I think that might get some people's attention. Like, what? Okay, I want to know who this is.
So, Michael, should the traditional OEMs, you had that blog post, should the traditional OEMs be terrified, to your point, right about now?
No question. Where are the advantages that BYD enjoys? One is, of course, we talked about their costs. They're highly vertically integrated. They are highly automated in their plants, really efficient. So they have scale, so they drive their costs down. So BYD vehicles, if you compare them apples to apples with equivalent products from GM or Ford today, are 25 to 30% cheaper. So cost price.
Isn't that partially because they control, 85% of the batteries are out of China, 92% of refining is out of China. So, yes. When you consider that a Taycan battery, I believe, is $80,000, something tells me in their $100,000 car, their battery is not going to be an $80,000 component, right? Uh-huh. And they also control supply, by the way. So
not only do they make the batteries, they make some of the best batteries in the world. BYD produces something called the Blade, which is arguably the highest quality, most efficient battery in the world today. Tesla sources from BYD, Ford and others are going to source from BYD too. So they have advantages in batteries. Other designs are vastly improved. Today, as we speak in China, there are thousands of Western designers, many from Europe, some from the United States, working with Chinese companies to dramatically improve both the exterior look and the interior. So much better looking, better quality, lower cost. They have dominance in batteries. Wow. How do you answer that if you're Ford or GM? Where do you compete?
Embargoes.
Walls up, more walls.
Yeah. Yes, more taxes. Steve, from you spend a tremendous amount of time really immersing yourself, in information, in data, in industry events, with dealers out there, having real conversations. 2 questions. Number one, would you say on balance that dealers, with respect to how they currently view EVs within the current circumstances, are largely optimistic or pessimistic, number one? And number two, all things being equal, based on what we have today and the landscape we have today, do you think that most dealers would feel that they are likely to have EVs push down net profit or prop up net profit?
Yeah, so I would say, to answer the first question, if there's an option 3, I would say more opportunistic, not pessimistic or optimistic. Dealers, from my 25 years of experience working with dealers, are opportunistic capitalists. And I think that they look at EVs and they a dealer, any average dealer isn't pro or negative EV. They're like, let me meet the consumer where they are. And if I've got consumers that want these things, I'll encourage my automaker to make more of them. And if I'm not feeling that demand from my consumers who are walking into my showroom, I don't need to be stocking any more of these. And as Paul said earlier, Phil said earlier, I think, he said very eloquently, like, you got a lot of dealers now that the inventories are backing up, both ICE and EVs. But when EVs are backing up, I don't want any more of them. I'm not feeling the consumer demand for them. So I think the dealers will continue to be opportunistic. And if there's demand for EVs, they'll be more than happy to train their salespeople to be able to sell these things and equip their shops to service them. But if they aren't feeling the demand, which it's slowing down, hasn't stopped, but it's slowing down. I think a lot of dealers will say, well, why am I, embracing this right now to sell these things? In terms of profit, I think, David, we've already seen this, and at least anecdotally talking to dealers, front-end grosses are being eliminated on EVs, and it's going to get pretty ugly this year, right? So they still may be able to attach, finance and protection products and such to EVs, although there's some question about that too, whether the consumer will attach as many protection products to an EV who has longer service intervals. But the front-end grosses already, I think, are eroding pretty quickly. We're seeing a tale of two cities around, inventories on new EVs being a lot higher than ICE vehicles, which means that the discounts are coming, and part of those discounts will be taken out of the dealer's hide. A lot of those discounts will be taken out of the OEM's hide, but the discounts are going to be coming over the course of the year. And it's not going to be pretty for front-end grosses for EVs. So if a dealer is looking at halfway through the year, which of these two types of vehicles am I making more margin on? They're going to say, I'm making a lot more money on ICE vehicles. Can we sell more ICE vehicles and stop stocking these EVs? And I think all of that pain is yet to really be felt this year.
There was reporting last year, I want to say it was probably around the mid-year point, that I believe it was 40% of dealers in the country had yet to sell an EV, and said, I won't sell them if I had them. So I do agree with you, and I think it's very well said. I like that you characterize that as not pessimistic or optimistic, but opportunistic. It's the nature of dealers to be resilient and to be inventive and to be opportunistic. But it does seem like the data would bear out that there is a relatively significant portion of dealers in the United States that are not seeing that opportunity, and perhaps the existing data that's out there, whether it's through 20 Group's NADA or NCM, or whether it's to the degree they could break out EVs, or the fact that salespeople appear to be taking a 50 to 75% pay cut every time they sell an EV, that right now, from their perspective, it doesn't look appealing, right? I don't know. I mean, it just seems like it's a very polarizing subject. I heard something yesterday that the massive percentage of EVs that were sold in the United States last year were sold in the 10 largest Democratic counties in the United States. And so another layer about EVs, which is interesting, is the fact that it is politicized. Which is so crazy, right? We've never had a product that where you walk onto the line, hey, Michael, welcome to ABC Honda or ABC Toyota. Just curious, are you a Republican or Democrat? Okay, you're a Republican. All right, all of our Republican inventory is over here. Phil, you're a Democrat. Are you a Democrat or you're a liberal? A liberal, okay, those are in the back. We've got the, I've never seen that before.
So plug-in hybrids, the moderates?
No, those are the independents, perhaps.
The independents.
But so that's really crazy. And the other thing, guys, is it possible, I'm curious, that we will see in the not so distant future something else for the first time, and that is technology obsolescence, which will impact the appeal of specific EVs in the market. You mentioned, Michael, these advanced batteries that are in China already. I mean, I believe I saw they already the solid state everybody's talking about coming. They have it already. They have a $30,000 vehicle with a solid state battery. So if I got a solid state battery that's going to render 600-mile range or 700-mile range, what's that going to do to the value of my 200-mile range Nissan Leaf, for example?
Right.
Is that coming?
I heard you say the words polarizing, and I was thinking it's confusing. If I'm a dealer, I'm a little bit confused because let's step back for a moment and think about American exceptionalism, just for the hell of it. So electrics do best in cities, short distance, lower speeds, stop and go, right? How do most Americans drive? on highways at 80 plus in big rigs. Sort of the antithesis of what batteries like. Batteries like, oh, this is a nightmare. We don't want to do this. Now in China and Europe, not so. They're taking mostly city commuting trips, and it's just ideal. So it fits China, it fits Europe much better than it does the United States. And if we were, 20 years ago, electrics are not popular in the United States because they just don't fit our lifestyle. They may never take off. US was the benchmark that we decided market trends. But today we find ourselves in a situation, actually for many states, many customers, EVs don't make sense in the United States, but the world is going electric. So what do? Do we just hold our cards and mostly go gasoline because that's what customers want and fall behind technologically? It gets very confusing because we're no longer the largest market in the world. We're no longer setting the pace with regards to future technology. Somebody else is. And how do we respond to that? Well, let's take care of the customer. All right. But we might, as a nation, be falling behind competitively to China, not our ally. Not our ally.
It's a little bit analogous to me, or similar to, for years and years and years, American manufacturers, or all manufacturers, if you were going to do business in this country, you had to create a 49-state car and a California car,
Yes.
as from an emission standpoint, right?
Yes.
And that was the deal. And you did that. Why? Well, because California was the 7th largest GDP in the freaking world. You didn't want to be carved out of that market, right? But this is interesting because now it's inverse. So, our manufacturer is going to be prone to make the equivalent of a California car for the United States versus a 49-state car for Europe, China, and the rest of the world. I don't think so. That doesn't sound very smart from a financial perspective. Do you guys agree?
I don't know. I think it's an interesting question. I hadn't heard a position that way before, David, but having a slightly larger vehicle with a larger battery and more capacity for range, there may very well be like Chinese vehicles that are custom built for this demographic.
Yeah, it's interesting. Or what are they going to start selling trailers that have a second battery, like we have the extra battery behind our iPhone? By the way, can you speak, Michael? I'm just curious. I've heard this a lot, especially from EV users, and just in full transparency, my wife has a Tesla X. It's her second X, and this one's a Plaid. So it has really significantly cut down the time it takes to get the kids to school, which is great when you go 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds. But the impact of cargo, when you load that F-150 Lightning, with a full payload that a typical person would, or you're towing a trailer, or you're towing or you're driving in altitude, or you're driving in cold, is it true that each of those factors can adversely impact range?
Absolutely. You take your F-150 with some trailing something, towing something, going uphill in cold weather, hot weather, you can cut your range in half immediately, maybe
pretty
more.
Startling.
So your 310-mile range goes to 150. No question. I've experienced it personally, having driven Teslas now for 6-7 years. Even the hills here in San Diego, it's beautiful weather, but I've got hills, and as soon as you start to climb, you got the air conditioning on, a couple boys in the back with their baseball gear, and I see that battery thing going. I'm getting signaled like, make a U-turn, go back to the last turning station, because you're not going to make it to your destination. So much so, this is a real story, halfway up a mountain nearby, like 40 miles outside of town here, I pulled over, turned the air conditioning off, told my boys to get out of the car.
It's so funny you said that, because it reminds me, I was born in 1959, and so my first cars were in the 60s. They were built in the 60s and early 70s, and you had to look for pristine weather. I mean, the perfect elements to put that car out on the road. And there were times that you said, hey, turn the air conditioner off. We're not going to make it. like you're a Scotty on the Starship Enterprise. And I laughed because when you said that, because my wife at one point was driving with dangerously low range. This is not like when you see that your light comes on and you have a gallon and a half left and you do some quick math and you go, okay, we get 30 miles, we got 40 miles, we're cool. No.
Yes.
And
a gas station's got to be within a mile or two.
Yes. Now with when it happens on an EV, complete anxiety overtakes you, and they should have an app on Tesla and others that connects you to your therapist, because you're within 30 miles of running out of range. You don't know where there's a charger, if it's going to be available. 1 out of every 3 or 4 chargers is inoperable, and you say turn off the air conditioning like the cars built in the 60s. It's I just ask for curiosity, because it seems like to your points, guys, that this country is different. The expectations are different. When we had high gas prices, we were coming out with Hemi engines, and high horsepower, 700 horsepower engines, and so forth. So I want to wrap up with this. First of all, I'll go to you, Steve, and my question is this. First of all, when it comes to 2024 and beyond, despite these challenges and these hurdles, and I've loved what you said in 2 regards. One is the opportunistic, and 2, you said clearly you got to be open-minded. At the end of the day, is it fair to say that we're talking about EV economics, that while in the short term there might be some hurt, might be some burn, might be some friction, that in the broad terms and long term, EVs represent a significant opportunity from an economic perspective for dealers?
Yeah, well, one of the things, one of the thesis areas that I have that I haven't heard anybody else repeat, but I've run this by a lot of dealers and I haven't got anybody who's refuted it, is on I'll go back to something Phil said earlier, right? The first generation of a legacy automaker making an EV, there's going to be a lot of recalls. They're learning a new competency, but once they learn that competency, we're going to be up and running. And a dealer on a VIN by VIN basis, a vehicle by vehicle basis, is going to see that consumer less frequently, because they don't need oil changes, they don't need spark plugs, right? These things are very, very reliable, and other than maybe tires more frequently, you're not going to see these people back in your service space. But having said that, and with all due respect to right to repair acts, which there will be nationally to allow the independent repair shop to continue to access the data on these vehicles, the level of technician sophistication required to work on these cars, coupled with the unique tools required to work on these cars. Think of, it's like an iPhone, right? Not any Joe on the street can work on an iPhone. They get in there, they're like, what am I looking at? I don't know what I'm looking at here. It's going to mean that the loyalty, even post-warranty period, for these vehicles to go back to their franchise dealer is going to be very high. So where we in the past always experienced this 70% breakage at the end of the warranty period, where consumers would stop going to their franchise dealer and go to the independent repair shop, dealers are going to be like, wow, here's the dynamic that's played out. I'm going to see individual cars less frequently, but I'm going to see my bays are going to be busier than ever, because I'm going to see cars coming back that are aged that I would have never seen before, that just can't get the service done at the local repair shop. So I think, dealers from a fixed operations, we understand how important fixed ops is for dealers, more than 50% of their profitability. I think, it causes anxiety when dealers start thinking about, man, these cars are going to be really reliable, I'm not going to see them. Yet, I think time will tell that dealers' fixed operations are going to be busier than ever.
It's funny you say that, and I was sharing something similar to dealers that, we only have 20% of the repair and service maintenance business, and there's no way independents for any reason are going to have the money, the resources, the capital, the technology, the tools, the training. It's not going to happen. Further than that, we still are less than 2% EVs on the road. So if you're an independent, where are you going to put your money and your focus? On the 98% ICE vehicles out there. So you're right. I think it represents a huge opportunity. Also, the average repair. I was talking to one of my Chevy dealers, and they had a small Chevy, I think it was a Chevy Bolt, $31,000 repair. You don't need a whole lot of those things to make a month. I mean, that
Oh, wow.
that is
Yikes.
that is the type of repair that you might see on a 15-year-old Ferrari, for God's sakes.
Right.
So you know what I mean?
Right.
So there are
Right.
collision. There's got. I mean, if I'm a dealer here, because of the economic opportunity, I might be looking at collision centers differently than I was looking at them 10 years ago, right?
Yep.
I might be getting all in on the tire business where most dealers fixed ops barely sell tires today. In other words, I would just seem, to your point, that I just need to basically rethink and reinvent
That's it.
the business model itself I have to be opportunistic. True?
Yep. 100%.
Yeah, great. I love that. Okay, Phil, how about from your perspective? What do you see
No,
from the financial side?
No, I believe that, as I was mentioning before, the two channels. One is the existing franchise or the existing manufacturer, and making the most of that, those opportunities, particularly as it relates to service, finance offerings, that customer, both technician training, that customer onboarding, and with the experience. I'm hesitant to whether it's 30%, by 2030, probably a little bit more conservative, probably see it as a segment, probably potentially 20%, but where I would be more cautious, or at least I have been more cautious with our existing dealers, are emerging brands. And what I mean emerging brands is any new franchises coming, simply given the history and what would be at stake. Now, there are going to be clear, things to distinguish. Is, like I mentioned, is this something that can be tucked in? Can it go into used car building, or what kind of capital investment am I going to have to do? So, the first answer is on existing channels. I believe, supportive, go through it. On emerging brands, I'm just a lot more skeptical.
So you're likely to not recommend your dealers pursue the brand new startup EV, let's say from Yemen.
Yeah, it just yeah, it's just
I think that's absolutely fantastic advice and spot on, Michael. I'll leave you with the last word. As you sit here with the tremendous investment, not that just that you invest today, but you've invested over a long period of time with respect to EVs. When you look at it just from a 50,000 foot macro view, huge opportunity from an economic perspective if you're a dealer?
Absolutely. I feel as though the way I think about it, David, is that we're in the very early innings, probably the top of the first inning in this transition to electric. So there's a lot of things that are going to happen, unexpected surprises, all the rest. If I'm a dealer today, good news, I can fly over to Europe, go to Germany or Sweden or Spain, where Chinese EVs are, MG brand, which was acquired by the Shanghai auto industry from UK 15 years ago. Last year, they sold 150,000 MGs into Europe, many of those into the UK. So stop over in London, you're going to see, here we go. Here's Chinese electrics. Talk to the dealers. How's it going, guys? What are you experiencing? What were the surprises? What were the upsides? So we're not, as a dealer, I don't necessarily have to guess all the time. Just step outside of the United States and go see what's happening in other places, specifically in Europe, because that's where the Chinese are really aggressive right now. And we can learn a lot about the upside as well as the risks. Yeah.
I think that's brilliantly put. I mean, the Netherlands, who have such a high adoption rate, Norway, 79%, Netherlands, very high adoption rate. Those service businesses, those fixed op departments are not out of business. And they have found that, as Glenn Mercer often says, we tend to, overestimate, at times and then underestimate and oftentimes find ourselves on the wrong side. Well, that's exactly what seems to have happened over there. To your point, you can go to the Netherlands today and you could walk into 10 different fixed operations departments and say, hey, are you guys still in business? Oh, you are? Hey, what's been the impact? The car's still brand.
Yeah.
I tell this to people all the time, whether you love Tesla or not, and I believe personally, that Tesla is a cult, and I mean that in a favorable way. Just like Apple is a cult. I've got a book on my desk that's The Cult of Mac. That the Macintosh is a cult. And what that simply means is it has gone beyond being a product. It is gone so far beyond that you could have somebody whose Tesla breaks down 6 times this year and they're still a fan. Because they remember that cult, just like the iPhone. But I want to caution anybody out there that doesn't think that there's service and parts opportunities. To Steve's point earlier, is go to any Tesla service center. If you have a Tesla service center in your area, please go and please witness what is a basic physical manifestation of Tetris, right? Because there are cars everywhere, in every direction, and they're not there because it's a reunion, right? They're there because they're broken. They need, so yes, maintenance is less, but Consumer Reports just in the last month reported that EVs are 79% less reliable than their conventional counterparts. Does that mean you shouldn't buy one? No. Does it mean that they're not viable? No. It just means, to Steve's point, I think this is where we got to pay attention. To Steve's point, this is, anytime you have innovation, you're going to have things break, and you're going to have a learning curve, and you're going to figure it out, and great companies do. And you're going to end up with more and more products as every year goes by that have higher and higher reliability and that bring greater and greater clarity to what the true economic opportunity is. So 2024, from my perspective, I think is going to have some pain. I think it's definitely going to weigh down, from my perspective, on net profit. I think it's going to create challenges with managing assets, new car inventories, and learning the used car side. But I believe, without a shadow of a doubt, any dealer that makes that investment in development, in resources, in technology, in training, and in the EV economy, they're going to win in the long term. Agreed?
Agreed. As I travel around the world, I make a point to ask leaders in every country, both the executives and government and consumers, are electrics the future? And in virtually every country outside of the United States, the answer is a resounding yes. People are convinced. Yeah, we're going. It's only in the U.S. that they go, hold on, let me get back to you. No, we have choice. Like, we have a decision to make. Which way are we going? The whole rest of the world seems to be going to critical minerals, powering batteries, powering cars.
I love that. I think there's a certain brilliance. There's a author, I can't remember the name, but he writes a book every year on things that are not obvious, right? Mm-hmm. And tied to the opportunities around the things that are not obvious. This isn't obvious in the United States. That might be a spoiler alert.
Right.
So on that note, Michael, Phil, Steve, thank you for taking the time to join. Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I know everybody else will as well. And if you want to reach out and connect with Michael, and I would really suggest, all 3 of these gentlemen's organizations put out really spectacular information via newsletters. Steve, Automotive Ventures. And I think, Steve, you have 2 now, right? I mean, you've got the monthly, the big book, I'd like to call it. And then you've got the weekly insights. Michael, you've got your newsletter as well. And of course, Axiom Advisors puts out a really well thought out, not big, but really well thought out. And every month, hyper focusing on one or maybe a couple things that every dealer should be paying attention to right now to optimize their results. So anyways, thank you for taking the time to join, guys. And look forward to seeing you at the National Auto Dealers Convention in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.